Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Got a lot to talk about today after another New York Giants disappointment on Sunday, a 34-24 loss to the San Francisco 49ers that, quite honestly, wasn't nearly as close as the final score indicated. A lot to get to today. And as always, on Monday morning, joining me is Big Blue Views Tony DelGenio. Morning, Tony. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ed. How are you?
I'm good. And Tony, great minds think alike, because you and I did versions of posts after the game last night with the same overall theme. And that theme, of course, is that it's time for things to change with the New York Giants, and that change has to come at the top. So I think that's the that's the focus today of what we're going to talk about. Just quickly, your thoughts as you were watching the game yesterday.
So I thought that this was a game that not they should win because the 49ers are still a good team. And they have one of the best head coaches in the NFL. They have one of the best running backs in the NFL. And they have great tight end, and so on. But they are very hurt and missing many of their best players. And so I thought this is an opportunity, especially at home, to get a win over a team that when fully healthy that you probably wouldn't be able to beat. And really even more than just getting a win, if they had a close, hard fought game that they lost on a fourth quarter field goal or something like that, I would have felt okay, even though it was a loss. You just want to see the team competing and hanging in there. And instead, we got an effort that was just non-competitive for the most part.
Yeah, we got it was one of those days where I have to be honest. I looked at it when the game started. I looked at it, and I think I put on Blue Sky, where I spend most of my social media time. Over on Blue Sky, I said, if this game gets out of hand for the Giants, this is really going to be bad, because there are an awful lot of red San Francisco 49ers jerseys out there, in the crowd. And that is exactly what happened. By the end of the fourth quarter, it was the 49ers fans chanting defense. It was the 49ers fans making all the noise. Giants fans were, as we've seen so many times over the years, Giants fans had headed for the exits. And it was ugly, and it was bad, and look, it's time for change. And you went through all of the candidates for change in your piece, and I talked about Brian Daboll and Shane Bowen, as well in mine. And look, let's start with Shane Bowen. And I have said a million times, I do not like calling for people to be fired, but it is crystal clear that Shane Bowen doesn't have the answers to fix this defense. I don't know if the scheme is bad. I don't know if the calls are inappropriate. But what I do know is that the same issues that we saw a year ago with Shane Bowen's defense are the issues that we see now. We see lack of ability to set the edge. We see lack of ability to fit gaps up the middle. We see too many defensive backs take poor angles. We see too many missed tackles in the secondary. Too often, we see guys give questionable effort at times in making plays. And look, that leads me to think, guys, They can say what they want. They can say, oh, we're all in with Shane and we believe in Shane and this and that. But if guys aren't learning, is Shane Bowen teaching properly? Is he teaching them anything? Are they listening to him? Can he teach? Does he understand how to use this personnel? I don't know. What I do know is the results are not good enough. This is a defense that should be based on talent, and I know how many injuries they had in the secondary. This should be a top 12 or so defense in the NFL. And the last thing I'm going to say before I turn the floor over to you, Tony, is I also said before the game yesterday, the Giants, with the wounded secondary that they had one chance yesterday. They had one chance defensively, and that was to throw caution to the wind, not play conservatively on defense, not try to just sort of sit back and hope they could keep the score down a little bit. The one chance that they had was to try to take advantage of a weak San Francisco offensive line, send 5 and 6 guys, use twists and stunts and get after Mac Jones. I think they hit Mac Jones 3 or 4 times during the game. I saw a number on X that in all of Mac Jones's dropbacks, the Giants sent more than 4 guys 3 times. And that's just not acceptable. That is just not acceptable. That is not understanding the way that you have to play. And I don't know. I think you might be scapegoating Shane Bowen, but at some point, if you're Brian Daboll, if you're Joe Shane, at some point you have to do something. You know, whether you have the right coordinator, in the building or not, you have to do something to show that you're not just accepting what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. I'm back. I agree with all of that, and I mean, you're looking at a team that has given up more than 30 points in 3 consecutive games, and in one of
105
them,
points in 9 quarters, Tony. 105 points in 9 quarters of play.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and one of those games was 33 points in a single quarter, right? So the question is, as a defensive coordinator, don't you look at that and say, okay, I've got to do something different. I've got to change things up. I've got to force the issue a little bit. And as you say, I know I'm hurting my secondary, and if I just sit back, then any good quarterback is probably going to be able to pick them apart because I'm missing my best guys, and not seeing any of that. As you said, he brought more than 4 pass rushers, 3 times.
3
I
times.
think he said, and yeah, all game. And the thing is that Mac Jones is the type of quarterback that you can fluster with a good pass rush, and that's what I thought was going to happen today. Actually, now there's a separate issue of why the defensive line wasn't more effective than it was when you have all these supposedly great pass rushers, but getting the quarterback antsy by bringing more than 4 some of the time is one of the ways that you do that. And my impression of Shane Bowen is that he doesn't want to scheme effective defense. He just wants his players to win their individual battles, and he's not putting them in advantageous positions to do so by confusing the other team. We had the issue a few weeks ago in New Orleans of Spencer Rattler getting up at the press conference and saying they don't disguise their coverage as much, and so that's a damning statement in and of itself, and so I feel like something needs to happen this week with 3 consecutive 30-plus point efforts by the defense. Something has to happen, and the easiest thing to happen in some sense is to fire Shane Bowen. The question, of course, is who then takes over for him. But I think they've got to make some kind of a move other than just speaking to the press and saying stuff.
At some point, you have to, and yes, it sort of reeks of desperation. And yes, it's too late to really make a difference because the Giants are 2-7, and it is what it is. But at some point, you as the head coach, you're Brian Daboll, you have to do more, as you said, Tony, than stand up there and say, well, our run defense has to get better. You have to actually do something about it. And look, John Mara gave Brian Daboll an out last year in January with Shane Bowen, because he clearly went after the Giants defense, and he clearly said the way they were playing wasn't acceptable. He clearly gave Brian Daboll a runway to go out and hire a new defensive coordinator, and Daboll chose not to do that. So, for me, Daboll has to, at some point, it's probably not going to save his job, but he has to, at some point, do something. And, you were talking about Spencer Rattler saying the Giants don't disguise coverages. Okay. And I just looked up the stats. The Giants pressured Mac Jones on just 5 of 28 dropbacks on Sunday. And we're sitting in the press box, 6 floors above the stadium. We're sitting in the press box, and we're watching 4 defensive linemen. And yes, Abdul Carter's a good pass rusher, and so is Brian Burns and Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon and all of that. But over and over and over, you've got a 4-man pass rush where all these guys were asked to do is plow straight ahead and try to win. Again and again and again, just plow straight ahead and try to win. No twists, no stunts, no zone blitzes to hide who was coming and who wasn't. And that's just terrible, and the run defense over and over and over, guys don't understand how to set the edge. They don't understand how to get into the prop, or they may understand it, but maybe they don't trust their teammates and they jump to the wrong gaps. At some point, you just have to do something. And to me, that is absolutely not to say that the players are not accountable as well. Because if you know what your job is and you don't do your job, or you don't try to do your job, or you don't hustle, or you don't try to tackle, or you just freelance, or we'll get into this one too, because I need to talk about Dexter Lawrence in a minute, or you don't take accountability for your own failings, that's a problem as well.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. And, of course, they're depleted in the secondary with all the injuries. And even when they were at full health, it still wasn't clear whether their secondary was as good as it needed to be, because their 2 free agent signings had played okay, but not great. And their 2 relatively high draft picks from last year had been, frankly, mediocre at best. And especially, I think, Tyler Nubin, who I think is having a very bad season, hadn't been playing well. So you already had an issue back there. And if you're a defensive coordinator and you feel like your secondary, and by the way, throw in the linebacking core, which is injured and ineffective at the same time, for the most part. When you have that, and the strength of your team is your pass rush, then aren't you thinking of ways to make the pass rush more formidable than it is, when you've got talent there, and it's just a question of, again, putting them in position to win more often and create havoc more often. And instead, as you say, he seems to just be sitting there and letting them rush and let their physical ability win the day. And well, to me, if you're a defensive coordinator, you're being paid to do something more interesting than that.
Absolutely. Tony, I need to talk about Dexter. Okay. And I'm going to preface all of that by saying, over the years, I've had immense respect for Dexter Lawrence. I understand how special and how unique the things he is capable of as a 350-pound man. I understand how special those things are. I sat with Dex one-on-one a couple of years ago, and he and I had a great conversation about how much he wanted to be great, about how much he wanted to go to the Hall of Fame, about how much he really knew. And this was when Brian Daboll first took over, how he knew that he had been good but not good enough. Okay. And we watched the last couple of years when he was a human wrecking ball, the most dominant defensive lineman in football. And what I will say, as I sit here this morning and we do this show, I am immensely, immensely disappointed in Dexter Lawrence. Okay. And that has nothing to do with his play on the field. Okay. Guys have good years, they have bad years. We don't know if Dexter Lawrence is working through an injury that they're not going to tell us about until the season's over. We don't know, all right, the reasons for why Dexter's production is down. We don't know if they're physical. We don't know if there's something going on in his personal life that's impacting his concentration. He says he still wants to be a Giant despite 3 years of 2-7 starts and more losing than winning while he's been there. But look, Dexter Lawrence is the leader of that defense. I have looked at him as the leader of the football team. And I'm sorry, his play hasn't been as good as it this year as it's been the last few years. He had 1 tackle on Sunday. And we know about his back and forth with Carl Banks last week. And I have respect for Carl too. Carl and I chat back and forth, a good bit. And Carl should not have said what he said about Dexter. It was perfectly within his right to criticize Dexter's play because it deserves to be criticized. It's not as productive as it was. But to say that teams don't respect Dex was going too far. But Dexter shot back at Carl, and he said, just because the numbers aren't there doesn't mean I'm not playing as well as I ever have. And yesterday in the locker room, asked point blank about his play after he had 1 tackle in the 3rd straight game that his defense gave up more than 30 points. Dexter said, I think I'm playing well. Okay. Which is, I'm sorry, that is throwing the rest of his teammates under the bus. That is not taking accountability for the fact that he has not been as good this year as he has been. When you're in the locker room, he also said, oh, I have to study harder. I have to do more at practice. I have to play better. But you can tell when guys are giving lip service to the words that they're expected to say. And he was giving lip service to all of that. He was adamant that I think I'm playing well. Contrast that to what Jackson Dart said after the game, which was, doesn't matter how I played. We lost. If you're going to be the leader of the team, which Dexter claims to be, and the leader of the defense, which the Giants need him to be, you can't say people need to look in the mirror. People need to be accountable without being accountable yourself. And I'm not hearing accountability from Dexter Lawrence, and I am deeply disappointed by that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't see Dexter Lawrence as the leader of the defense. I see Brian Burns as the leader of the defense. Because Brian Burns, I feel, first of all, Brian Burns is playing great football as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think he's having a tremendous season, and he's the guy who seems to be bothered by the Giants' poor play on defense. He's the guy who seems to be accountable, even though I think he himself is playing very well. And so to me, he's the leader of that defense. And you mentioned Jackson Dart, and And isn't it amazing that 6 games into this guy's career, he's already the perceived leader of the offense, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it and it took them all of maybe 1 or 2 weeks probably to be perceived that way
Mhm.
among the fans. But now, I feel like he's this really young guy, and he's coming out and he's expressing, without saying it in words, he's expressing his disgust with how things are going, and sending the message, basically winning is everything, and if we're not winning, things aren't good if we're not winning, uh, and you just don't see any of that from Dexter Lawrence. He's
No,
just there.
and
He's just like a defensive line.
right. I would agree also that Brian Burns has become easily this year the best player on that defense, and I have immense respect for Brian Burns because he's always accountable. Now it's weird because Brian Burns left the locker room without speaking last night, but I don't think that Brian Burns ducked the media last night. I think that what happened was, if you're going to catch these guys in the locker room, they come in, we're allowed in the locker room. These guys are headed to the shower or getting out of the shower, and they get dressed, and if nobody's in front of their locker waiting to talk to them, they go. And I think that what happened was we were across the locker room talking to Dexter Lawrence as an entire group. Brian Burns was ready to leave. Kayvon Thibodeau had already spoken. So nobody was there. So Brian left. It's not necessarily his responsibility to stand there and wait. When we are able to speak to Brian, he's always accountable. I'm not going to kill him for leaving last night. So, but I want to sort of change stream here since we're talking about Jackson Dart. We need to sort of transition into Brian Daboll. Okay. And one of the things that I caught last night from Jackson Dart, there has been a great relationship between Dart and Daboll. Okay. And the common theory has been Dart is Daboll's ticket to keeping his job. If the Giants can win enough games, if Dart continues to ascend. Jackson Dart last night was given an opportunity to defend Brian Daboll, was given an opportunity to say what he has said in the past, that he loves Daboll, that he wants to be coached by Daboll, and all of those things. Jackson Dart deflected. Okay. He did not, in my view, and I don't have exactly what he said in front of me, but he did not issue a defense of Brian Daboll. And that was very telling to me. That what I took from that was that Dart's priorities are in the right place. He cares more about winning than who the coach is when they get there. Okay. But I found it interesting that I didn't think Jackson Dart he didn't criticize Brian Daboll, but he didn't go out of his way to give his standard. I have a great relationship with Dabes. We're going in the right direction, and all of that. He wants to win. And I think he fully recognizes that if Brian Daboll isn't going to get him there, then then something needs to get done. I mean, he didn't call for Daboll to be fired. He's not going to do that. But I found it interesting. I found it really interesting that Dart did not defend his head coach.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I didn't get that from anything that I read, but you could tell from the few things that he did say that came out in print anyway, that he was extremely frustrated by the lack of winning, and I mean, obviously they took a big blow on two big blows on offense when they lost Neighbors and Scatterbo, right? So you can understand that their offense isn't going to be as explosive as it used to be, or as it had the potential to be, I should say. It never really got to the explosive point, but I think it's easy to see a frustration in him, and when you watch how the games are being called, I have to think that yeah, he
Well,
has the right to be frustrated. I mean, they're putting him at risk, having him run so much, and yeah, the guy's getting beat up out there. And yesterday he really did get beat up a couple of
well,
times,
to-
and it's like, where's the downfield passing game? And it's like, you gotta, and where are the intermediate and deep shots? And yes, Malik Neighbors is not there, but you do have other receivers. And early in the season, Wandale Robinson was catching deep balls from Russell Wilson, and so on. And where where is the uh, attempt to attack opposing defenses? The Giants aren't attacking opposing
well,
defenses. They're just like, they're running the ball and kind of trying to
they
methodically move down the field.
they didn't do any of that yesterday. And it's interesting, Tony, because I wrote that, Wandale Robinson caught 9 passes for 40 yards. Okay. And I wrote yesterday that what the Giants used on offense in their passing game was the Daniel Jones, Wandale Robinson runs a stick route game plan. That's exactly what they did. That was the Daniel Jones. Well, we don't think we can pass protect. We don't think we can throw the ball down the field. So we're just going to spend the entire day throwing 5-yard stick routes to Wandale Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's the first time this year we've seen it. Okay. And really quickly, Tony, you said you hadn't seen Dart's remarks. I'm going to read you part of what Dart said. And I apologize, folks. I know you probably don't want to listen to me read here, but Dart was asked specifically about his relationship with Daboll and if he feels pressure to get things turned around because of what could change if the Giants keep losing. Obviously, that means because Daboll could get fired. And Dart said, I can only control what I can control. Um, and then he said, coaches call the plays, but a play can technically work against any defense or any coverage, which is kind of, to me, a little shot at the play calling. He said, I just want to live in the moment. Basically, players have to be better. The coaches aren't the ones on the field. To me, again, he didn't directly criticize Brian Daboll or Mike Kafka, but he didn't defend them either and say that Brian Daboll is the right coach, for him for the future. So, and as you said, Tony, I wrote this last night too. For 2 straight weeks, the Giants, at the end of blowout games where they were obviously going to lose, for 2 straight weeks, they ran and ran and ran and ran Jackson Dart and made him take hits because he's not going to defend himself. He's going to go try to get that first down or that touchdown. For 2 straight weeks, they made him take hits he didn't need to take. They put him at risk when they didn't need to do that. And we've seen example after example after example of NFL head coaches doing things like that. Look at what Dan Quinn did Sunday night with Jaden Daniels. The Washington Commanders were behind by 31 points. Jaden Daniels, first game back from an injury, was still in that game. And now, because he took a hit that he didn't need to take and shouldn't have been in that game, now he's probably not going to play for the rest of the season. I do not understand why NFL coaches refuse to admit that they've lost a game and do the smart thing and protect their best players for the next game. I don't understand it. And you don't want Jackson Dart to get hurt. You don't want him to get beat up. You don't want him to suffer injuries that are going to affect him long term. And I just don't get it. What I said last night was that's not developing Jackson Dart. That's getting him killed.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I think it's a delicate dynamic in the Giants quarterback room, taking Dart out and letting Russell Wilson come back in to mop up. You know, considering Russell Wilson's kind of career stature, and the fact that he started the season.
But they gave him that job, Tony. They gave Russell Wilson that number two job, and that's the number two quarterback's job.
Yeah, but what right? And right, it is the number two quarterback's job. What I would say though is that if you're going to keep Dart in the game, then you don't call running plays for him. Okay,
Absolutely.
And you give him instructions to say, you know what, drop back, and if no one's there, throw it away. We don't want you getting hurt.
Down.
So we're not gonna get down. We're not gonna put you at risk, and blah, blah, blah. So you have to either put Russell Wilson in the game, or you've got to call plays for Dart and send the message to him that if you don't see anyone, just get rid of the ball and live to play another day. But they're not doing either of those things. I think what you're saying, they're doing exactly the opposite of that, and they are putting them at risk. And I think the Jaden Daniels example is another good one, and I think what it comes down to with both of those guys, Daniels and Dart, is that they're super competitive players, and probably you can't ask them to play conservatively. And so, if that's the case, which it may very well be, then really you have no choice but to take them out of the game. And so to me, that's, I think, the thought process that a head coach has to be going through. If you can get them to play conservatively and preserve themselves, then fine, you leave them in the game. And don't ask Russell Wilson to come in for mop-up duty. But if you know your guy and you know that he's incapable of playing conservatively like that just to save himself, then you save him from himself and get him out of the game.
Yes, and Daboll didn't do that. Hasn't done it for 2 straight weeks. And as I said, NFL coaches by and large don't do that. And I just don't understand it. When it comes to Daboll, I had said a couple of weeks ago that I thought the Giants were entering a stretch where it was Daboll's last stand, where he had to win, where he had to show that things were changing, in order to keep his job. And what we saw yesterday were planes flying over the stadium asking for changes to be made, fans leaving the stadium early, yet another opposing crowd dominating the stadium in the fourth quarter. The same mistakes that we see over and over and over, back-to-back false starts on 3rd and 3 that turned 3rd and 3 into 3rd and 13. Questionable in-game decision-making, the Dart stuff we talked about. And Tony, I'm sorry. 4th and 3, 4th and goal, 3-yard line, down 20-7 in the third quarter. If you don't go for the touchdown there, you're not trying to win the game. All right. And that was exactly my thought. And I flashed back to, and I said this to a couple people on press row, I flashed back to Joe Judge when Brian Daboll did that. Because at the end of Joe Judge's tenure with the Giants, he was calling games. He was managing games to make the final score less embarrassing. He wasn't necessarily trying to win them. He was trying to make he felt like they were going to lose, and he was trying to make the final score less embarrassing. And for me, you're in the middle of the third quarter. You get a touchdown there, or you're late in the third quarter. You get a touchdown there. You're in a one-score game. Okay. You're clearly not the better team. You're clearly not going to dominate the fourth quarter. You go for the touchdown, you try to win the game. You go for the field goal, you're just trying to make sure you score a requisite number of points. And I don't know, for me, the only way I can put it was that was a losing type of decision.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And you that just reminded me the fact that we were talking about field goals. That speaking of not being accountable, I saw the quote from Graham Gano that he seemingly bristled a little bit when people were asking him, kind of critically about his 45-yard field goal miss, and I thought that's really a tone deaf response that he gave to those questions. And so, that I think that's one of the big problems this team has right now is that the accountability is coming, I think, from young guys like Dart, and it's not coming from veterans who should be accountable. And if that's the case, where your veterans aren't being accountable, then I think you really have to rethink how you make up the roster.
Well, it's interesting, Tony, because we talked about Dexter Lawrence and accountability, and I hadn't seen the quote from Gano. He did bristle a little bit as I look up the quote. He's like, "That's the only one I missed all day." Well, you know what? All the ones that you kicked in warmups don't count. So the one you're supposed to make is why you warm up. The one you're supposed to make in the game is why you warm up. Now, I will say this. The snap wasn't perfect. Okay. The snap was a little bit high. All right. But the ball's down. The ball's ready to be kicked. You have to make that kick. All right. That's but look, this is another reason why it becomes apparent when you're around these teams. It becomes apparent, when it's basically done. Okay. When things are basically done, and nobody in that locker room is going to say, we're out on Brian Daboll. We're not trusting Brian Daboll. We don't want to hear from Brian Daboll anymore. But look, I was in the locker room on Thursday. Now, this is a team where things aren't going well. Okay. In the Giants locker room, there has always been, there's a pool table. There are a bunch of couches. There's there's a couple of ping pong tables. You know what showed up in the locker room on Thursday when I was there? There's a basketball hoop so the guys can play Nerf basketball, and an air hockey table. All right. There's no room for anybody to move around in the Giants locker room anymore. There's barely enough room for the players because of all the little toys and stuff that they have, in the room. And then you get to Sunday night. And on the other part about being in the locker room is there's 53 players on the roster. There's a bunch of guys on IR. There's probably 75 lockers in the room. On any given day when there's media availability, when every player is supposed to be available to media, on any given day, there's probably 20 guys in the room, 20, 25 guys in the room, and it's usually the same 20, 25 players. Where's everybody else who's supposed to be in the room? Tay Banks hasn't been in the room all year. A couple of other guys are barely ever around the room.
Tay Banks was escaping through the restroom.
So that's I was getting to that. So where's the accountability? Okay, and then you get to Sunday night, and I've already talked about Dexter Lawrence. Okay, and then you have Tay Banks, who hasn't wanted to answer questions all year, who escapes out the bathroom so he doesn't have to talk to media with his pants around his ankles. Okay. I mean, what are we doing here? Where's the accountability? I would guess there will be no repercussions for that, but when there's no accountability, when it's not coming from the locker room, I mean, that just tells me that tells me that there are issues on this team that Brian Daboll is not going to solve.
Yeah, and in that sense, he may not have the right temperament, or not temperament. That's not, I don't know, or the right approach to be an effective head coach. And I'll say something. I'm seeing a comment in the window about asking about Steve Spagnuolo, brings Steve Spagnuolo in as head coach. And so I'll say, maybe that's a good opportunity to respond to that comment. I love Steve Spagnuolo. I'd love to see Steve Spagnuolo as the Giants defensive coordinator, because I think their defense would look a lot different with him calling the shots. The question, and I don't really claim to know the answer to this, is what makes a good head coach? And whether Steve Spagnuolo would be a good head coach for the Giants right now, I just don't have any idea, and I don't have really the insight into that. And it's kind of the same thing as elevating Brian Daboll from being an offensive coordinator to being a head coach. And various things that he's done during his tenure suggest that maybe he's not very well suited to being a head coach. And so really, I think that the question becomes, what makes a good head coach? You know, and if you ask who are the good head coaches out there, I think there are people who hire good people to be their coordinators and stand back and let the coordinators do their thing while he kind of oversees the general philosophy of things and the larger issues with the team. And so I don't know who makes a good head coach, but whatever it is, it's someone who I believe commands respect in the locker room from both sides. And it can be an offensively oriented guy or a defensively oriented guy. You can have a Jim Harbaugh, who I'm sure commands respect. You can have a Sean McVay, who I'm sure commands respect. And they're two guys who kind of come from opposite sides of the ball. But I think there's more to being a head coach than just whether you were a good position coach or coordinator, in the past. And so I don't know who the right person for that job is. It could be someone like Spagnuolo, could be someone else. But I think there's a quality that you need to be a head coach that has been missing from Giants head coaches for a while now. Obviously, I think ever since Coughlin, right? And I think about Parcells, and who was a defensive guy. So I'm not sure what the right answer is for the head coach position, but I certainly wouldn't mind having Steve Spagnuolo as my defensive coordinator. I think we'd see a lot more aggressive defense than we're seeing from Shane Bowen. That's for sure.
Tony, I have said this in the past, and I'm not sure if all of our viewers are aware of it, but I have said in the past that, like you, I don't know what kind of head coach Steve Spagnuolo would be or would have been, but I have often wondered. Spags was the interim head coach at the end of the 2017 season, okay, when the Giants fired Ben McAdoo. Spags interviewed for that head coaching job. That job went to Pat Shurmur, who did not have any more success as a head coach in Cleveland than Steve Spagnuolo had as a head coach with the Rams. Okay. And I get they wanted a guy, to work with the quarterbacks and, and to guide a transition to a new quarterback and all of that. But I cannot help but wonder. I don't know if it would have worked, but I cannot help but wonder if the Giants would have saved themselves a lot of trouble by just hiring Steve Spagnuolo as their head coach back in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
He would have been an adult in the room. He loves the Giants organization. He would have, and he was a guy that the players already knew and respected. I don't know, but in retrospect, I think probably the Giants should have given Steve Spagnuolo an opportunity to be their head coach, back then. As for what you were saying about what makes a good head coach, I'll let people know, look, I've already begun to work on a list of potential head coaches, guys to talk to. And all of the requisite coordinators will be on that list. But look, a good head coach isn't, good offensive coordinator, good defensive coordinator, doesn't matter. And I think NFL teams, NFL owners, they get so enamored of the latest and greatest hot coach from the best team in the league. And whether he can lead people doesn't seem to come into the equation. But the most important thing for an NFL head coach is, can you lead men? Can you get men who are highly paid, who are alphas, who have lives of their own, who have adulation from fans at every turn in their lives? Can you get these men to listen to you, to follow you, to believe you, to play for you? That's what Dan Campbell can do in Detroit. Okay. That basically is what Andy Reid does in Kansas City. Okay. That to me is what makes an NFL head coach. That is what made Bill Parcells. Not the fact that he was a defensive coach, the fact that he could lead men. That is what made Tom Coughlin a good head coach. Yes, he played offense in college, and technically he might have been an offensive coach, but he was a head coach who people respected. And for me, that's what it comes down to. And I believe that the Giants need a head coach. Maybe not a Super Bowl winning head coach. I see people talking about Mike McCarthy in the comments. And I'll be honest with you, Mike McCarthy's probably on my list because he's got the resume, he's got the Super Bowl title. But I think the Giants need a head coach who has won, who has been successful, who has done this before, not the next latest and greatest offensive or defensive coordinator who nobody knows whether or not that person can be a head coach. Been there, done that too many times already.
Yeah, and so if you think about successful and unsuccessful head coaches around the league, young guys, experienced guys, I think for example, you had Brandon Staley a couple of years ago, who was like the hot guy as a defensive coordinator, and he became head coach and just couldn't get the job done as head coach. You have Mike McDaniel, who was also a hot offensive guy. He became the head coach. He hasn't been able to make that into a good. Right now, you got Mike McDonald, who was a defensive coordinator, and he became the head coach in Seattle. And I got to admit, I know very little about Mike McDonald because he's not a guy that people write about a lot. He's not a guy that makes a lot of headlines. But he's got that Seattle team playing great, and so it's you have to figure out, if you're going to go with a young guy, how do you tell the difference between a young guy who's going to be able to take on that leadership role and one who's not? And I don't know if there's a way that you can figure that out very much in advance. I've got to tell you, true confessions, I thought Dan Campbell would be a disastrous hire for Detroit. I said, what are they doing hiring him as head coach? In his initial press conference, and he was talking about was it breaking knees or something like that. I can't remember.
Yep.
But he was saying all kinds of outrageous stuff, and I said, "Oh, this is going to be funny." And he's turned the Detroit Lions into one of the best teams in football. And as you say, he has the leadership qualities, and so. I think given the Giants situation, I feel like they do, if possible, need to bring in someone more experienced than any of those examples that I just gave, where you're gambling on a first time guy to do it. If for some reason John Harbaugh's future is not in Baltimore, I'd hire John Harbaugh in a minute, because he's the type of person who does command respect and does have the experience and so on and so forth. But they've got to figure out what is the thing that you want from the head coach, and it's not just the guy who was really good at the next level below that, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. I think Mara, maybe tried that with Joe Judge, and maybe he was convinced that Joe Judge could be that type of leader, but you can't. There's more to it than that. I think you've got to have the X's and O's, and at the same time you've got to have the leadership qualities. And there's a reason that a lot of NFL teams fail, because there aren't all that many guys out there who do that. And but that's what I'm looking for is do you have someone who can command the respect of the entire room, not just the one side of the ball that he came from.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say this, last thing I'll say is, I know how many times John Mara's gotten this wrong. All right. But NFL teams get it wrong a lot more often than they get it right. That's just the way it is. There are only a handful of really, really good, quote unquote, above reproach head coaches in the NFL. And you've got to keep trying until you get it right. I think that unless something utterly unexpected happens here over the next 8 weeks, 9 weeks, I think that we're in that head coaching search situation again. And look, Tony, I also know we haven't talked about Joe Shane at all. I don't honestly think we have time to do that today. Just so folks who read Big Blue View know, we'll be talking about Brian Daboll a good bit. I've been working on a little bit of a list, and we'll publish that. We will also at some point go through the pros and cons of whether or not Joe Shane should remain as general manager, what he's been responsible for, what he hasn't been responsible for, and the pros and cons of splitting Joe Shane and Brian Daboll, or whether they should both go. We'll get into all of that. But Tony, I think that's a good place for us to end. It's not a comforting thought when I think about the Giants having to go on the road this week against the Chicago Bears in a game that a few weeks ago I thought the Giants might have a chance to win. It's not a comforting thought when I think about the Bears having just put up 47 points.
Yeah. I don't know that I'll be comfortable seeing the Giants play anyone for the rest of the season.
Yeah, unfortunately, we ride that roller coaster, Tony. We ride that up and down roller coaster, and they beat the Chargers, and then they beat the Eagles, and you think, oh, the things are turning. Things are finally turning, and then the last 3 weeks happen, and we're here where we are right now. And as I sit here today, I think 2-15 is a possibility. As I sit here today, I think 2-15 is a possibility. Who knows what I'll think 2 or 3 weeks from now, but I can't see a game that I feel really good about. So who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah, well, you know that you've gotten to a point of no return when you start thinking a lot about and checking Tankathon to see where the teams are
Started
having.
doing that this week too. So anyway, Tony, I think that's a really good place for us to call it a day. Thank you for all your insight, Tony, and you always manage to either get to things that I was thinking about, in some sort of roundabout fashion. You seem to manage to get to them before I do sometimes, or you may always make me think about things in a different way. So I always appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, Giants fans, thank you as always for watching. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.